And I don't know how to save the recording, but I'll figure that out later. Okay. So, Shona, hey, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
I just want to tell you a brief little story. I'm a little embarrassed but shocked as well. So I want to tell you something, and we're going to chat a bit about organizational politics, which is something that subject both you and I are quite interested in. So a number of years ago, I was having a discussion with my father, and I asked him what he thought his three sons would become when they grew up. And so my brother Richard, he said, "Oh, he's going to be a psychologist." And I said, "Okay, and he was." And my brother Glenn, he says, "Oh, he's going to be a sales guy, right?" And it was. And I said, "What about me?" And he looked and he said, "Oh, I always thought you were going to become a lawyer." And I just about fell off my chair. I mean, that seemed like I was I was taken aback by it. And I was like, "Where did he get that?" He says, "Well, you just always like to talk and you like to argue. So I figured that was like right up your alley." And I was,
Fits the profile.
"Oh, okay." And I was like, so I'm like, whoa, I've never thought that he saw me in that way. And he said, "It's not that." He says, "I always thought you just always had this interest in politics." And I was
Wow.
like, oh. And so I guess that it was, the information was available to others and I was blind to it. Um, and so what I realized though is that ever since I actually started working in organizations, I personally had this interest in the subject of how does that work? What's the significance of it? In some ways, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in terms of you build a product or a service, you make it available, you treat patients, or you make sausages or whatever it is, and that's the business that's going on. But that there always seems to be something else in the background that isn't always immediately visible that dictates what people can do and what they can't do. And that becomes organizational politics. And as you and I both know, me more from my coaching and consulting background and your background in actually being a leader and CEO and executive of healthcare organizations, that there's a lot to be said about that, and that people who are in the know and pay attention to the politics seem to make more things happen. They know how to navigate. Some people who can be extremely smart, extremely talented, and who don't pay attention to or don't know how to pay attention to the politics can be limited somewhat in their ability to be effective. So, is that does that sound like a good place for us to start our discussion?
Oh, I think it does. And that is a wonderful story and connects the dots as to why you've been in the spaces you've been and have had a keen interest in organizational politics. And I think the interesting thing is that in my experience, the phrase organizational politics isn't one that is often used to describe organizational politics. So it often carries a negative connotation, maybe rightfully so. And so yet people don't call it what it is and don't acknowledge it. And so then don't have a strategy to kind of manage or navigate it. And I think one of our thoughts and hopes for today's conversation is to shed light on a topic that exists for all leaders or anyone working in an organization. Is there's always the underlying organizational politics that you have to contend to, whether you're aware of it, blind to it, just kind of keeping your head down, any of that, it still exists. And yet there isn't a lot of discussion that's out there that's useful for leaders who do understand that they are dealing with organizational politics and to help them frame it that it can be positive if they have the right mindset, approach, and strategy to do that. So I'm excited to be able to talk to an expert from a young age who's interested in organizational politics
So
and has
little
the
did he
wisdom.
know. Little did he know.
Yes, exactly. That here you would be today talking about it
Yeah,
many years later.
yeah. And so you raise it, Sean. You raise a really interesting point, though, in that in my experience, the brand, if you would, of organizational politics for most people, or the connotation, is that it's negative, and that people see it is that it's a tool that people use towards others to craft personal gain,
Mhm.
often with negative consequences or repercussions for the other, right? So it has that brand or picture or aura around it. And I know from talking to you before, and I know my own self perspective and from some of the learnings I've done, is that it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, there are some people like some of the folks like you've talked about, and I've talked about Henry Mintzberg and Peter Block, who actually talk about it as a tool for a positive movement, as a constructive tool. And so I think that might be a good place for us to start, because my recurring experience is that most people, you say politics, and there's a
Yep.
recoil that occurs literally, that people go back and it's like, oh, well, he's or she's, and they're so political, and it has this negative perception. And rightly so, because many people use power, position, connections to create advantage for themselves and disadvantage for others by using the tool of organizational politics. My experience, and I know yours, is other than that, is that it's something that we can reframe. It is something we can create a different mindset and approach with. And it is a way, to me, if I think about it and try to simplify it, it's, huh, what are some of the tools at my disposal so I can figure out how to better influence you and to influence him and to influence her and have impact, right?
Agree.
Right. And the advantage I see of that is that that's sustainable, right? Because if in fact I approach you in a way to, and I use the resources at my disposal to get something done that provides personal gain for me and loss for you, chances are, at minimum, you're going to be wary of me in the future
For
and
sure.
be careful around me. But if I go about and I think about how to influence and impact you and her and him and them, and there's a win for me and a win for others, or at least there's consideration, that puts me in a place where people will want to work with me again, and I will want to work with them again. And so that's the place, that I want to go. So there's a payoff there, right? And it's doable, it's trainable, it's learnable. However, given the history and the negative memories that most of us have of organizational, or many of us have of organizational politics, it's almost like you got to clean it up first in order to insert something better and new into the situation. What do you think?
Yeah,
How does that land with you?
I think everything you say resonates well from my personal experience as a leader, and then coaching and consulting other leaders, whether direct reports, colleagues, or clients. And a lot of times you're dealing with negative situations or interactions with folks, and you don't know what you're dealing with, and you have to kind of step back and kind of like think about what you're facing. And not a lot of folks make the leap next to, oh my goodness, this is organizational politics at work. They're looking at just a single behavior or trait of the individual that they're having some challenges with. And so my personal experience and advice I give is to step back and take a look at who has influence, formal or informal, in organizations, and then take a look at what is motivating them and try to understand it through their eyes. And so your win-win approach is, I think, the number one advice that I give
Mhm.
to myself and to others, is that you try to understand what motivates the individuals that really do have the influence and authority in organizations, largely behind the scenes, and find out what's motivating them, and then how you can support them in terms of what those goals are as it aligns to an organization. And then take a look at what your own goals are personally and from an organization's perspective, and figure out where the overlap is, and to build in the influence through those conversations of a shared interest. There's always a shared interest, even in the most interesting places where you think they would not be interested in providing support to an organizational goal. When you unpack it in terms of what motivates them, there's always common ground to build from. And that is always my approach. Unfortunately, for folks, they don't feel comfortable maybe even entering into those discussions. They may be fearful. They may have heard reputational issues with those power brokers that are informal in organizations and don't want to take those risks. And I've had many personal examples in my leadership career where that was the case. Some examples I think of is when I was a vice president and had clinical operations reporting to me. And I first started, I got the surgical program reporting to me. And 6 months before, this team had a third-party assessment that spoke about all of the challenges, including the politics amongst the surgeons. So I was a little heartbroken to find out that I would be having to clean this up and deal with these very political, nasty surgeons who were very unwilling to work with administration. And so I kind of put that aside after I kind of slept on it for a few days. And I just kind of showed up as I do as a leader, which is seek to understand what is going on and to listen and to figure out who is really kind of rowing the boat, so to speak, within the team and the department, and get to know them better and understand their pain points and understand how I can be in service. And I appreciate that sounds naive, facing a negative political wall. And when I unpacked the branding of this surgical group and removed that and didn't let that kind of sway my own perception of who they were as a person and as a group, and I kind of got into understanding their challenges better, their pain points, their frustrations, and how that triggered them to act out in ways that they themselves perhaps didn't feel good about, but didn't know how else to act to get what they needed done. When I started to show up that way and be that way, it was amazing how I could align with them, help them achieve their own goals as a group or as an individual surgeon, and put it into the context of our organizational goals as well, around budget, around metrics for OR time, number of surgeries being done, case overruns, etc. And that hadn't been done before. So in the past, it was just basically two sides, administration, physicians, basically their own turfs, and they never met. They saw each other as evil and worked behind the scenes, both administrators to get what they wanted done, didn't engage the physician group or the surgeons. The surgeons, through their power sources, which were deep at the time, to be able to have influence in the community and the board. And so they took those paths because they couldn't get heard and they need to get done what they had to get done. So they engaged in the only game they knew, which was politics. And so coming in to be able to deal with that, showing up to really understand their needs, their issues, their challenges and pain points, and build that into what would work from an organizational perspective in terms of our own goals and pain points. We were able to, over time, understand each other, build consensus, and use the channels available to us to get the right things done for the right reason. It wasn't always an easy path. And yet showing up in that intention, I was able to build relationships with the most significant power brokers in informal positions in the surgical team who had decades of legacy, we'll say, that they left behind in terms of administration or administrators that they had taken down. And they did that because they didn't trust, no one listened to them, and no one understood their own challenges. So I think from a win-win perspective, that is how leadership needs to approach those situations, and the remove kind of the labels that had been placed on those power brokers, informal or formal, beforehand.
Mhm.
Remove it and then go in with the seek to understand and really listen to what it is they need. And then when you do that, you can fit that into where you need to go. And once you build that relationship, you can then move into the space of explaining and influencing what it is the organization needs as well, and what you need as a leader as well to be successful. And then you're able to kind of co-create those strategies together where you're both winning and it's not a win-lose.
Mhm. It seems like you've thought about this once or twice.
I've lived it for many years,
Yeah, I-
many different situations. Yes.
Yes, and I do know some leaders who've spend as much time as you figuring this out and learning it, the significance. I also know many who are, I'll say, not as well informed. Um, you said a few things and you used a couple of phrases multiple times as sort of the pathway for you, which was listen to others, seek to understand, uh, try to hear different points of view or perspectives. And the thing, one word you used that added to that, which was, okay, so if all that's true, then what might be the pathway we could take to move things forward? And that really struck me as a significant thing. So there's a lot of it is who do I have to be? How do I have to think in order to get the attention and have reciprocal attention from the others? And so that's the different perspective. It's the listening, it's the seeking to understand. But then you went outside of that and sort of said, huh, so what's the pathway we could take here now, right? So you're putting it into that context. So if I step back from this for a second, and let's say you have a young woman leader that's you're her mentor, and she kind of goes like, Shona, like, what, you like seem to know how to do something that a lot of people don't know how to do, and you talk about things in a way I've not seen before. Two things. What would you tell her? How do you go about seeing and hearing these things you described? So I have two questions, but let's tackle one at a time. How do you actually, how does a leader open her eyes to see these political things, first of all? How do you learn to see something that is kind of ephemeral, hard to see, and until you see it, you don't even know it's there, right? So how would you, or if I was your mentee, how would you tell me, like, check this out? How do you see this? What's your trick?
Right. So, first of all, I think if you're coming into an established organization with organizational politics, I'll say on the negative
And most
side,
of us do come in that way, right?
right? So, already in play, we'll say, you're usually coming in with having heard some of the stories of whatever, we'll say, informal or formal power brokers in the political system have taken down X, Y, or Z. I mean, those stories are there, sometimes embellished and what have you. So if you're in the system already, you're hearing it, seeing it, sensing it. And so that was my case, indeed, to the extent where it was a third party report and the example I provided that helped kind of describe some of that. But absent of a review, you're paying attention to how decisions are being made in reality in an organization. So you have a policy or a strategy that says one thing, and yet the reality of what's existing in operations is something completely different. And so it's really trying to understand that as you look at what's happening in real time. And so part of my approach to listening and experiencing is being in the middle of all that. So, during my career, if there were some specific hot spots in organizations or organizations that were really, the politics were taking down an organization's goals set or strategy, I would immerse myself into the department team. So in the case of the surgical department that I described earlier, I went and observed a couple surgeries. I would spend some time as the environmental services worker cleaning parts of bone chips and stuff like that off the OR floors. And I would just immerse myself in it, not all day, every day, but I would do a couple shifts here and there as I kind of felt called to do, to really get a sense as to the feel of what is happening, and to also to build the relationships needed to be able to have those kind of conversations to build trust going forward that are needed to start to build those win-wins. So the more you know, the more you see, and the more you trust your own observations versus relying on the stories you've heard in the past, the better equipped you are to assess things for yourself and build the relationships and ask questions in real time that give you better insight. So if you just sit in a boardroom or a meeting room all day talking about the organizational politics or what's eating, culture eating strategy for lunch or whatever the issue is, you're just repeating what you're hearing and you have no fact checking for yourself. So for me, the hotter the spot in an organization, all the more reason for me to be embedded in, to see it, hear it, feel it, for myself and then ask the clarifying questions in real time when you have the opportunity to do so with the folks that can provide you the real answers.
Hmm. So a couple of words pop up in my head again as I listen to you, right? So one is goes back to my original coaching mentor, which is he would always talk about, so what's the business reality? And what you're telling me is that one of the ways that you have found and you would encourage others is to just look at what's real here in terms of the way this organization operates. How is business conducted? How are decisions made? Who makes the decisions? How are expectations set? What are the priorities that people have? Because it's different based on the circumstance and the situation. So that's the first piece. Second piece is what you're saying is, if I'm really going to understand that and be able to work with the politics in the organization, I have to immerse myself in the middle of the situation. So it's not abstract, it's real for me and my experience. I plunk myself down. Not everyone would do that in terms of literally putting yourself in the what's the term they use, the surgical theater
Mhm.
and clean up bone chips. However, that certainly would be a way that one would develop a real, excuse me, taste and feel for what it's really like and what people are dealing with. It's not a story about, it's not a YouTube video, it's what really happens there. And when you're putting yourself literally in other people's shoes, you begin to develop a feel for what they go through. On the other hand, my recurring experience is that when you do that, it helps to engender respect for you by others, because it's like, yeah, she's not just like an academic who's taking notes and or an executive who's like hands off. She's putting herself in here. Now she really knows what goes on, so she can do something. She understands something, so I can listen to what she has to say. The other thing, though, that just the question that surfaced for me, Sean, as I was listening to you is, so how are organizational politics different from organizational culture? Because it
Mhm.
seems like you were implying something there. You didn't use that word, but anyway, to help me understand, uh, what's your understanding of that subject, if you would? How do they
Yeah.
fit together? Are they the same thing? Are they what's the deal?
Well, my view, and I've not done any deep research on the question, but my view is organizational politics is part of organizational culture. It's how that culture is existing on a day-to-day basis. So culture being the bigger set of how we get things done, where the organizational politics is part of that. So they are tied together, but I see politics as a subset, I guess, of the constructs of organizational
Okay.
culture. And it's just a reality of how things are being done in an organization and how decisions get made for real. And in organizations, so I think it's an interesting question. Is I think politics will be described as the things that bring down a strategy in an organization. And yet it's a great culture that allows an organization to achieve its goals. So you don't really hear where organization politics is the reason, an organization succeeds, but you hear the organization's culture is why, organization succeeds. But you'll hear the opposite. It's the organization's politics that brought down an organization's success or gets in the way. So I find it interesting that I haven't seen much describe organizational politics as a reason why organizations succeed, and they use culture as that kind of descriptor to lend itself to success. So it just, to me, denotes the fact that politics is really framed for the most part in the negative connotation, when the reality is you can use organizational politics as an influencer and as a tool to be able to create a structure to achieve the goals and objectives that you want to deliver on.
So are you suggesting perhaps a redefinition of terminology in a way, in that positive or constructive organizational politics is simply the ability to read the tea leaves in terms of how things really work here in our culture and business reality, and then once you understand that, figuring out ways to effectively influence and create impact within that framework. Is that, I mean, not just the words I'm putting on what you're saying. Does that sound about right to you? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think
You don't have to agree with me. I'm just questioning. I don't know.
yeah, I agree with that. And it is around our personal goals. So I think that's where politics, is the heart of politics is in our own personal goals in terms of what we want to achieve and how that influence us in our day-to-day decisions and actions. And so if our goals personally are aligned with an organizational goals, it is understanding how all that works together to be able to read the tea leaves to get what you need to get done.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is when your personal goals are in direct opposition of organizational goals and you're showing up as an informal or formal leader working against the organization because your personal goals don't align with that. I mean, that's a pretty extreme example. And it's hard then to read the tea leaves because those folks operating in that space where their personal goals go against organizational goals, and they're usually not disclosing that on the face of it. It's also hard to unpack that through relationship building because it's usually kind of kept close to the chest, so to speak. So reading the tea leaves to figure all that out, I mean, I think that's pretty sophisticated to kind of even unlayer that in those kind of extreme examples. My experience, most people do have their personal goals. They largely line up with an organization's goals or they don't interfere with them. And so you can figure that out, work together, achieve a common, platform to both build on and do your win-win. But I think of some extreme examples where personal goals are in direct opposition.
There needs to be some sync. I mean, for example, I think it would be very difficult if you were extreme, anti-smoker person to work for a tobacco company, right? For example, that would be tough to line those things up.
Yeah.
One other thing where you took my attention, and this is where I have to admit, there's a book I read. I'm not going to name the author a number of years ago. It was extremely influential, despite the fact that I found the writing and the author to be about as pompous as anyone I had ever experienced. I was offended by some of the things he said. That being said, he made a point that really has stuck with me forever, which is that he said, I don't care if you're the new hire CEO of an organization. The culture trumps everything. And it is up to you, even if you're in the highest ranking position, to figure out how to adjust yourself to fit into the culture because it's bigger, it's stronger, and it's been there a lot longer than you have. And yes, you may be able to make some changes to it. You may be able to alter it. You may be able to find ways for you to more easily and smoothly fit into it. But at the end of the day, it's bigger than you are. And it's up to you to figure out how to carry it forward. So it does, again, it speaks to the piece of, can I get my goals to be enough in sync with the organizational goals to make things work? And I just keep going to, and I think where we can take this conversation going forward, or two things keep striking me is, what are the possibilities we can help people to think about and create? Because I think that's one of the deals. And the second one, I think clearly this needs some reframing or rebranding, given the the negative image that people have of organizational politics. It's akin to, I find that the people often have you approach someone and you go, so Shauna, I have some feedback for you. Would you like to hear it? And generally our reaction is we recoil because it means, what did I do that he doesn't like, etc. And so I think it's a similar thing. And where this goes as a possibility to me now, let me make a clear distinction. I think that politics and organization are very different than politics per se, the politics that run government and such. It's the word is kind of the same, but it's very different. On the other hand, in terms of possibility, I hearken back all the time to two senators in the United States, Orrin Hatch of Utah, a pretty conservative Mormon, Ted Kennedy, an extreme liberal from Massachusetts. And so very, very different politics and orientation. Those two guys got a lot of good work done, and they learned how to work together well
Right.
because they had respect for the opinion and the experience of the other party. They brought that respect and trust and curiosity to their working relationship. They figured out how to find things that they could agree on. And from that, they were able to get a lot of good work done.
Absolutely.
And so, in organizations today, obviously, people are going to have different points of view. And in fact, case in point, it reminds me of a gentleman I was working with recently who, is an engineer by training. That's what he's done. He's moved up his position, and he looks at me one day and he says, "Look, I got the engineer stuff down." He says, "But now, given my role and what they're asking me to do, most of the people I got to talk to are either accountants or lawyers." And he says, "They don't think about things and look at the world the same way I do. So if I want to be effective, I have to figure out how me, engineer, learns to talk to accountant and lawyer and frame things and discuss things